the with the modern American two-party system, it seems like there is always one party that plays up religious values more than the other. Not that they are both sides. Usually, and especially in most cases with elected officials, most of them still claim to be Christian. But the Republican Party seems to play, not necessarily play up to religion more, but seems to be more vocal about their religion. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think a couple of things here, and if maybe I'd like to widen the angle here a little bit. So, for example, there are certain issues that one party or the other, at least historically, seems to be much more connected with, or at least issues that are associated with certain parties. The language of family values, at least for as long as I can remember, is associated, let's say, with the Republican Party. The idea of the military, for example, is associated with the Republican Party. Now, maybe welfare is associated with the Democratic Party. Maybe the idea of looking out, if you will, for each other in the sense that it takes more than an individual to create, if you will, who we are as persons, is associated with the Democratic Party. But here's the thing about this. As one steps back and think about this, for me, if someone says, I'm all for family values, my first question will be, please explain to me what that means. Does that mean that it is an anti-divorce? Does that mean that we're the only ones who care about our children? Does that mean that we're the only ones who think that marriage is sick? In other words, what does this mean? And it seems to me that one of the things that has happened is that certain ideas have been repeated over time, so much so that, in fact, it's connected only with one group. Generally, and I'm saying this somewhat carefully, generally, it seems that persons who are much more inclined towards the Republican agenda, if you will, seem to be much more open in speaking about their religious faith. Folks who are inclined towards the Democratic agenda seems to be, at least historically, less inclined. And so this idea that the more we speak about what we believe, the more we can embrace certain things. And therefore, over time, it seems to me that that one group that seems reticent to speak openly about their religious beliefs have been deemed or have been sort of cast as the group that is not so much in favor of family values, that they are not nearly as religious, that perhaps the Christian ideals, quote unquote, upon which this nation has been built, this is not a group that we should entrust those ideals to in terms of preservation. I have to tell you, I don't buy it. I don't buy that kind of distinction. I do not believe that simply repeating something to the point where you take it as a certainty in defining who you are necessarily makes it only true. I just don't believe that. I think it is the case that both sides emphasize the importance of family values, but perhaps in ways that are different. I don't think we can speak of family values. I don't think we can speak about God. I don't think we can speak about military, for that matter. I don't think we can speak about social welfare and social justice in the abstract. It is not good enough to simply speak about those things in the abstract, in theory, unless you do something about it. I'm not convinced that those of us who speak most loudly about those issues do nearly as much concretely about them.
That actually goes right into one of our next questions. Actually, it was as far as actual policy that is actually enacted in the United States is concerned, especially with things like war, abortion, the death penalty. How often do you actually see people who, claim to be supporting Christian values and the teachings of Jesus? And how often do you see them often supporting something that seems to be completely contradicting what they claim to represent? For instance, Governor Rick Perry of Texas claims to be a devout Christian, but as governor, he oversaw the execution of a record number of executions for death row in Texas prisons. How do you see that contradiction?
Well, here's how I look at this. I think all of us, I include myself here, just that I try to be attentive to these matters. All of us who, let's say, have a sacred text that we hold to be important in shaping how we see the world and ourselves. And let's say, for argument, we're talking now about the Bible, both the Hebrew, the Greek, the Old and New Testaments. Okay? We pick and choose. Some of us are really, we do this, some of us, in a horrible way. That is, we pick and choose the parts that we like, mostly because they sanction or they challenge ideologies that we have. So, for example, I've heard many people, interestingly, say, I am absolutely a believer in pro-life. By the way, that's a good thing. That's a good thing. Again, I might ask, what does that mean? Now, so for example, one of the statements that repeatedly has come out of the Vatican, and the present Pope and his predecessors have spoken about this, is their strong opposition to the death penalty. But then I also hear others who might be Catholic in their religious beliefs, in their denominational sort of connection, who say, I'm pro-life, but I believe in the death penalty. Or many Protestants who are pro-life but believe in the death penalty. I think that, and by the way, and then of course there are all kinds of justification that are given as to why that distinction needs to be made. I think it goes deeper. And part of what strikes me is that we find areas that we simply hold to be so true for ourselves that we have to find biblical or religious justification for those areas. And we go looking. Not so long ago, and this is a matter of record, a congressman from the state of Arkansas, who said, for the life of me, I've been looking in the Bible to see where slavery is condemned, and I can't find it, so I don't know what the deal is. This is not a century ago. This is the year 2012. This is what we're finding now. So if I happen to be, let's say, a pro-war person, if I happen to have an impulse for war, or if I happen to have an impulse for peace, if I believe strongly in the death penalty, or if I believe that maybe punitive elements are important for our society, but I'm against the death penalty, I think one of the things that I have discovered is that we can go and we can then either directly or somewhat in circumscribing the text, navigating around the text, allow the text to say what we want it to say. And we've done that. We've done that with slavery. We've done that with women. We certainly do it with the death penalty. We do it with war and peace. In other words, I think it should be the other way around. It should be, what is it, as we come to the text, that the text is saying to us, and how does that shape our worldview, as opposed to saying, here is my worldview, and I have to find a way in which the text sort of, if you will, underlines this and makes this true. And I think it's the latter thing that is deeply problematic, and I think that's one of the areas that I find within our society that is very, very common.
It often, for me personally, comes up in discussions with individuals about religion, the issue of picking and choosing in regards to religious doctrine. What are your thoughts on that issue? Is picking and choosing inherently hypocritical, or can someone hold a faith or claim to, or should indeed someone claim to hold a faith and yet sort of practice this sort of picking and choosing, or this, shall we say, either a sort of selective memory or an interpretation and discernment with what they consider their faith and their interpretation of their holy texts or doctrine?
I think that, for example, a person of faith, if one is honest with oneself, first of all, before trying to be honest with others, if one is honest with oneself, I think taking, let's say again, the Bible as a point of departure for illustrating this, that one might say, you know what, there are parts of the Bible that I find really, really troubling. So let me speak personally here. I take it very seriously, but I'm not a literalist. I think if I took it in literally word for word, if I'm honest with myself and with each other, I will run into a wall very quickly. At which point, then, I will have to try to both explain and justify something that the text simply does not say. Let's say that can be, let me rephrase that, something that the text says that cannot be understood literally. Now, so for example, there are many parts of the text that I would rather not deal with, to be honest. I would rather not deal with. I would rather not deal with the idea of a God who is involved in some fairly violent things within the text. I would really not want to deal with the idea, let's say, of little children who suffer because of something, let's say, that their parents did. We have that in the text. I would rather not have to face the idea, if you will, of firstborn being killed. I would rather not face the idea of nations at war that wipe out other nations. Now, but here's the thing, it's part of the fabric of the text. And the question, therefore, is not whether or not I should like it or not like it, whether or not I should admit that it's there or not there. The question is, what do we do with this text? And what I would suggest is that we do not redact the parts that are problematic, but face the reality of asking difficult questions and having the courage to live with those questions without simply reducing them to silly and sometimes, well, to easy and sometimes silly answers. Now, I can make an argument why the text propels us towards the pursuit of peace. But I also know that there are wars. I can make a really, really good argument, I will tell you right now, why, for example, the death penalty is absolutely heinous, and that God, in the very first murder in the Bible, which is in the context of fratricide, chooses not to kill the person. Punishment, but protection. Now, I don't have to make that up. It's there. And so one could make these arguments, but there are parts that are very problematic. Parts about women, parts about slavery, parts about war, part about innocent suffering for people who are wondering. Famously, Job. And this is not that Job brought this on himself. This is, very much the involvement of God, if you will, in the suffering of Job. So it seems to me that one of the first qualities is to face a text that is not monolithic, that is layered, that has stories which at times will cause us deep angst and grief, and many stories, historical and otherwise, that we simply have a difficult time embracing fully. It is not an invitation to cut them out and only focus on the parts that you happen to like. That's the manner, at least, in which, ideally, I think the text ought to be approached.